Just by way of introduction, I'm Adrian Hames and I'm the Head of Transport Planning in the UK with about 260 people all working on a range of projects. I've worked in transport planning for about 30 years and much of that time has been spent on delivering transit projects in the UK. So I'll just hand over to Neil for him to introduce himself.
Thank you, Adrian. My name's Neil Porton. I'm a technical director at WSP in the UK. I'm also head of people and culture within the transport group, of which Adrian helps lead. And I've been project manager on a number of projects that we're talking about today.
Thank you, Neil. Okay, so today's agenda, we're going to take you through and demonstrate the role of transit in improving health and well-being for a better quality of life. The focus is on people, design and delivery using approaches highlighted within the 3 case studies you can see there in the agenda. So please do ask questions in the chat as we go. Okay, so I'll just hand over to Neil, who's going to talk through the first 2 projects.
Thanks very much, Adrian. We thought the easiest to sort of bring this to life by talking through some projects. So kind of what was the challenge, how do we approach it, what benefit do we bring, and what was those innovative things that we used within these projects that you might like to think about. So one of those is the Marston Vale line. So the Marston Vale line is an existing rail line. It's got quite limited rail services on, so the frequency is not particularly great. And it runs from Milton Keynes to Bedford in the southeast of England. So there's a lot of stations along here historically, not a particularly long piece of rail line, but a lot of stations, so a lot of stopping services, which is not particularly attractive. There's some national infrastructure coming in called East West Rail, which is going to make a drastic improvement in that provision of services, particularly between Oxford and Cambridge, 2 big university cities in the UK, with great economic gains that are predicted in terms of creating better linkages and linking those industries that feed off those university powerhouses. So we were brought in by the client to see, with this national East-West Rail, rail provision coming in, increasing speed and frequency on this part of the line, our client wanted to try and better understand, first of all, how it could help maybe rationalize some of those stations, so we didn't have quite so many, or the level of service was reduced or improved in certain ones, but also how could we get the most benefit from this nationally significant infrastructure at a local level? How could we use first mile, last mile solutions to essentially create greater benefits than the sum of its parts and have that added value to those local communities? Thinking about that complete door-to-door travel, so not just the middle miles that the rail line provides, but how do we travel from the door to the rail station, and at the other end, how do you travel to your end destination? Next slide, please, Adrian. So when approaching this for our client, we tried to come up with a different way of looking at things. So we wanted to take a people, place and connectivity approach, rather than maybe a more traditional approach of mode and movement. So as part of that, we developed a new tool, which we call Shift Trip. It's an online-based tool, and it considers 3 important factors, which are in those circles at the top, essentially. So which are people, place and connectivity. So what we wanted to do was to better understand the place as communities, understand how people moved around, what influenced their travel choice, think of them more than just a population size, who actually lives in these places. We also want to understand people's propensity for using first mile, last mile mobility options, form their placement within locations along this rail line to ensure there was more successful first mile, last mile provision and usage in terms of it being put in place. Now, what I'm going to talk you through, the theory is this could be used anywhere in the world, essentially, but it's, for us in the UK, was based on 3 key data sets. So one of those was about connectivity. How do we represent connectivity in this combination? And that's where we use the Department for Transport in the UK's journey time statistics. This is statistics on journey times in the key peak, so the AM peak 7 to 10, and looks at a varying different journey purposes in which you'd undertake. So not just commuting, so food stores, education, healthcare, town centres, employment, transport hubs, those sort of elements. It gives average statistics based on a geographical location we call an MSOA, which is super output area, in terms of those average journey times, both by public transport and foot cycle networks in terms of that movement. We then looked at place, and we have our census data in the UK, so we use that to give us a sort of density of a location. And then most importantly, we want to look at people, and that's where we use a data set called Experian Mosaic data. This is retail-led data, effectively informed from spending behaviours, habits, your credit scores. It all feeds into this data set, which we have access to through subscription. And essentially from that, we can categorize people based on their behaviors, spending habits, etc. And that breaks down into 15 typical personas, which you can see on the screen there. Aspiring homemakers, down to city propensity, senior security, different types of people. So we took an area here in this study and we looked at the different type of people that were there. In using this, therefore, then we were able to think about what those people wanted, their drivers, essentially their human factor variables. So what drives them, their independence, time, what's the important things for them? Then look at the different types of first mile, last mile modes that are available, what we call the mode factor variables. So how best do those human factors match each of those first mile, last mile modes, such as powered cycle or powered scooter or various different first mile, last mile. In looking at a combination of those together, we could identify, based on the makeup of a location, the likely propensity for use of each of those first mile, last mile modes, essentially identifying the sort of available market that's available for them. Next slide, please, Adrian. So what was key with this is that it really helped our client to understand who lived in these places and where first mile, last mile could create beta benefit, as well as sort of that rationalization of how the wider transport network looked along this line. What it enables overall is for decision makers can target investments in locations where there will be greatest benefits, greater understanding of first mile, last mile markets, where there's most applicability. We also see to identify market share, so better assurance on the potential user base for putting these different types of modes along this rail corridor. Essentially, therefore, it assists the practitioners, and this was intended as a tool that could be used by local authority officers as well in other locations, to assist practitioners in focusing their efforts on where they implement first mile, last mile investigation, linking back to carbon and health agendas. So it essentially plays a playbook of first mile, last mile options to consider for each location, enables a really quick analysis of a range of sets of data to help inform a more mature decision-making process on where these new forms of transport are placed. Next slide, please, Adrian. An example of where we've used this on another mass rapid transit project is in a recent work both myself and Adrian have completed on the Hertfordshire and Essex rapid transit. This is linking two authorities, essentially two sort of municipalities just north of London. There's really strong, within these two authorities, there's very strong north-south links to London, as you might expect, but very poor east-west connectivity. And there's a range of pockets of small towns and cities linked with rural areas in between. There's planned for about 100,000 homes and jobs that were coming to these locations. And there's a lot of new employment, particularly around biotech and particularly around the film industry, where if all the plans go ahead, they would have as much film studios as Hollywood. So how could we link local residents with these key high value jobs within the local area without them needing to sort of travel inside and outside of London? And we're looking within a 10-year time frame, and we wanted to create an affordable, inclusive transport system that was financially sustainable. Next slide, please, Adrian. So we undertook a holistic approach to delivering this transit project. So our approach sought to consider the indivisible linkages between mobility, the energy and carbonisation transit system, and that digital layers, both in terms of the reduction in needing to travel in the first instance when we looked at the implementation, but also how digital networks need to be enveloped and ingrained within the transport system itself. So those are useful journeys where you can undertake other activities. So we set out to provide a system that considers people's behaviour, the places they go to, and their digital connectivity. We also then obviously need to look at layering this with the practicalities of road space, materials and funding as part of the whole system. This was therefore an ideal environment in which we could use the Shift Trip tool to understand people living in each of the communities and their behaviours. Next slide, please, Adrian. So when applying the tool I've talked about a little bit earlier in this specific location, the benefits we sort of gain from this is First of all, this was a bit of a unique location because it was a chain of towns. It wasn't your usual dense urban environment for MRT. So we were looking very much at how we could apply this in a rural and an urban form. We used the shift chip tool to understand potential customer bases, their likely trips and drivers, which heavily influenced our routing and scenarios for model testing more widely within this project. We identified locations for mobility hubs based on this information. So we could think about how we could link with those strong north-south rail connections with this east-west movement, and therefore how we could use different scales of first mile, last mile to penetrate further into those communities. So we identified a flexible delivery strategy at the end of this, where we were able to look at it relative to funding opportunities provided in central government in a phased approach, building on current commercial PT networks and a bus partnership that already existed in this local area. Thanks, Adrian. Over to yourself for the next example.
Thank you, Neil. So I'm now going to take you to a project that has been delivered over the past 2 or 3 years. It's the Leeds Passenger Transport Investment Programme, which will deliver improved transport and transit networks for up to 1.8 million people across the West Yorkshire region in the north of the UK. The project itself has included a range of bus priority corridors, investment in a number of key corridors to improve bus service reliability and reduce bus journey times, a range of park and ride integrated with other transit modes and ability to access the north and the south of the region, a redesign of public realm across the city centre, looking at new road layouts, street designs to reduce congestion and improve the environment for people. Development of 3 new rail stations and connections across the city, and a range of bus delivery for improved seamless travel and connectivity and new vehicles. So construction is well underway and a number of the schemes are already operational, bringing significant benefits to some of the communities. So we provided a range of multidisciplinary services, included feasibility through to detailed design, business case, environmental, net zero, construction supervision, active travel, street design. Apologies for the ambulance in the background. Transit operational advice, planning and consents, and stakeholder engagement. So our approach was founded upon community engagement, including all parts of society, to develop the designs using innovative approaches for online consultation, workshops, disabled groups, including bus and transit operators, balancing transit with active travel and a network-wide approach to maximise the challenges of historic constrained street space, and then using net zero carbon assessment and framework tool to calculate and ensure carbon impacts are fully accounted for in all stages of the project development. So our opportunity here was to influence carbon outcomes and climate resilience in a transport project's early stages. Established carbon assessments often only become viable as more detailed understanding of a scheme evolves. This gap risks opportunities for targeting investment to tackle the climate emergency being lost. We therefore developed an innovative appraisal framework tool to calculate carbon impacts at all stages of the project development. The Carbon Zero tool was developed to support decision-making and appraisal for the project in the context of our client, Leeds City Council, declaring a climate emergency. Predictions of CO2 impact in support of business cases, planning applications, and for the decision-making on designs really helped demonstrate to the client and the communities where the project were being delivered how the passenger transport investments contributed to reducing carbon emissions and delivering net zero. The Carbon Zero appraisal framework provides a proportionate process to ensure alignment with the net zero goals and resilience to changing climate conditions. So it brings together a range of tools, methodologies, data sets, and provides a mechanism to compare schemes and options from an early stage of strategy, optioneering, concept development, through to calculation of impacts, grouped in 3 categories. So user emissions, so the mix of characteristics of modes using the infrastructure and the relative model travel distances by mode and associated emissions. Embodied construction, maintenance and end-of-life disposal of the asset, calculation of carbon produced at each stage of the delivery and across its whole life, and then additional impacts and opportunities. So thinking about the wider situation, whether it's loss of planting, new biodiversity, blue and green infrastructure, and assessment of this change that could be made in the overall scheme. So in summary, we had a range of key challenges that we sought to address through using the tool, and we delivered the following benefits to the client. So including a carbon culture from the outset, ensuring an ability to present meaningful data to inform decision making at all stages of the project lifecycle, resilience to climate change, so we identified and prioritised investment needed to ensure resilience is built into the design, and then clear communication, so really so people could understand what it means for them and what it means for their lives in terms of doing nothing in relation to CO2 impacts and climate emergency, and really getting that engagement and consultation effective around the issue. Robust appraisal, so making sure we can have confidence in the evidence at all stages of the project. Looking more cumulatively across programs in the region, so making sure the appraisal is holistic across everything and how projects interrelate to each other. And then overall looking at how we can reduce carbon impact and optimise schemes to maximise reduction in emissions. So the project is well underway, and as you can see from that quote there from the client, the benefits are really starting to pay dividends with the people and communities. So what are the key takeaways here? All transit users are pedestrians and are part of the active travel ecosystem, so it's important to consider that in terms of how we can deliver good health and well-being for all. Transit schemes can be delivered as linear parks or biodiversity, or alongside major urban walking and cycling infrastructure in a coordinated way. The quality of infrastructure is key. Having identity and pride together with being happy in your surroundings are key to quality of life. So we need to create systems which promote a sense of pride and then are part of the culture of our communities. This creates sustainable places and communities. Thinking about social value and thinking about that is critical for leveraging skills and employment opportunities when delivering transit systems. Jobs and skills are a long-term requirement for good societies. What we do is important for our communities and people. We are directly influencing people's lives through the places we create. So transit projects have a role with this, and they're much wider than just delivering a route to get people to their destinations. They can deliver positive health and well-being and underpin good quality of life, making connections whether physically or with other people or in social way. And we need to all reflect on this, and this is an extension of who we are and what you do. So a journey is also just not a process. It's about how you seriously feel about the climate or your own health and how you value your time. So some of the pandemic and things that have been happening recently in the economy have really strengthened this view, and we need to take it now more seriously. So thank you very much for your time today, and we now have the opportunity for questions.
Thank you, Adrian and Neil, for your presentation. So before moving into the Q&A period, I would like to remind attendees to enter your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform. And also you can download the PDF version of the presentation from the handout box on the dashboard. Adrian and Neil, if you can open your webcam, it will be really nice to see you both. And we will start with the first question. how do we balance all user needs within a constrained street space?
Yeah, thank you for that. Just to apologise if there was some background noise. I'm not sure what's happening outside the Cambridge office in the UK here, but lots of activity with emergency services. So apologies if you heard that. So in terms of that question, thank you for that. I'll start, Neil, if it's all right. So, we need to think about the design of our streets and not just transit as a movement corridor through our streets. We need to think about how we design from the outside in, so thinking about our space for people. So we need to look at the movement and place functions within our streets and how the role in the number of people that uses them. We can also think about activity zones. We're talking about well-being and health and quality of life here, and I think you need to think about the activities and the zones within a street and how they can use and be flexible depending on the time of the day and the particular use. And think about the community interaction as well. So how do communities come together to, within the street space?
Thank you. There was a question here about the demographics that you used in the first case study. How can it help to solve issues around isolation of older people or disabled people to have access for public transport? How did you use the demographics to solve these kind of issues?
So it's interesting, yeah, with the tool that we used in that example, obviously, as we said, we use this retail-led approach with the Experian Mosaic data to identify these personas, these categories of people, of which sort of elderly, mobility impaired is one of those. And so they have different drivers potentially. It's that ability for accessibility. It's more about safety potentially for them. And maybe they have more, particularly for the elderly, they might have more time availability. So time is not necessarily a problem, but safety and comfort is more of an issue. So that identified a different type of sort of customer in some of those locations where there was great densities of that kind of persona, those type of people. And therefore we look to try and match that with those first mile, last mile opportunities that might provide that. So maybe shared taxi services or demand responsive transport is more applicable to those locations than it might be in a younger urban environment, so to speak. So that's where we use that to categorize those data sets, to try and understand exactly who lives in these locations, and then try and pitch transport solutions to them that better meet their human factors, as we called them in these projects, their needs around those key elements of time, safety, health, etc.
I think, Neil, it's just also about thinking about the user experience, isn't it? And the barriers and actually working with users in terms of co-creating projects. So the design is developed with them with disabled and older people from the start.
Yeah, it's not seeing it as a problem, it's seeing it as an opportunity and thinking about how they experience. So when we think about Mobility Hub, how is a disabled or mobility impaired person, or not just those, even the other forms of disability, experiencing that environment, how would they see it, how would they use it, and thinking that at the ground up in terms of how we're designing those elements.
Thank you. Sorry, I got a message that the PDF is not working. Sorry for the handouts. So I will share this in a message after the webinar. I will have a link to the PDF of the handouts. So apologies for this. The next question is regarding the tools that you mentioned, Shift Trip and Carbon Zero tools. Can they be used outside of the UK?
So it's very reliant on the sort of, certainly for the Shift Trip tool, it's very reliant on the sort of data sets. So if we had a proxy for the connectivity piece, which we use this DFT journey time statistics, and if there was that sort of retail piece, which should be available elsewhere, it's just finding a sort of a provider of that sort of data, then it can be replicated in terms of the theory could certainly be used. And with the carbon tool, that's much more applicable. That as long as we've got the outputs in terms of the assessment of the scheme, in terms of some of that's the modelling outputs, it's quite adaptive to be able to use that to generate the calculations on the amount of carbon reductions you might generate. So yeah, applicable, but would need to be looked at specifically in terms of what data sets are nationally available for those locations.
Thanks for clarifying that. Next question is, what are the benefits of a people-based approach in developing a transit project?
Shall I start, Neil? So I think it's really thinking more widely about the role transit projects play it's about encouraging sort of that social interaction. It's about improving safety for all. It's about addressing some of the barriers we just talked about. It's thinking about how the public space and the street interacts with a transit project, thinking about the communities that are around it and how you create places as part of that transit corridor, not just thinking it as a movement corridor, but somewhere as a destination in its own right, and how it can ensure it's developed and designed with those users, with those in mind, really thinking about that. And I think the benefits you get by taking that approach is around reducing loneliness, encouraging more active travel for more health and well-being, improving the environment around it, friendlier, greener, happier, healthier, more productive, prosperous, quieter, safer. All of those things are positive benefits that an integrated and effective transit system could solve.
It's also the practicalities of getting it achieved on the ground. And often if you think about not just particularly if it's an express service, we've had another recent project that's been looking at sort of delivering from a park and ride. So there's the benefits from those on those buses, but those buses weren't necessarily stopping a lot of those neighbourhoods. So how are we creating something for them? Those neighbourhoods were having to put up with the construction impact for a number of years. So we had to think about how we could bring in SUDs, create green places, create cycle walk infrastructure more locally for them as part of the benefit of the project, so that they had buy-in, which enables them to get political buy-in, which enables us to actually deliver it in the ground, rather than often these schemes are developed and then sometimes get very stuck in a sort of, particularly in the UK, in the planning process, if we don't have that sort of local consensus buy-in and political will. So those are key elements, not just only in the benefits you can generate from good transit systems for society, but also in achieving them and getting them constructed in the first place.
Thank you. I will take the last question, just due to the time. Could you please outline the main key points that we need to address through transit projects in the future to improve people's quality of life?
I'll keep it quick because I'm conscious of time. So I think it's about flexibility and being adaptable. So that's catering for our changing ways of life and how that continues to create opportunities for people. It's then balancing human health and nature with how you use technology and how we tackle that. And then it's making sure projects are co-created, so developed together with communities and the users to make sure they're as successful as possible and really deliver social benefits for all.
Thank you, Neil. Would you like to add anything? I think Adrian excellently covered that one, so I'm not sure I can enhance it. But I think obviously COVID's shown that we have a changing nature of how we're traveling, how we're moving, and not just typically maybe we're always thinking about commuter trips, but as Adrian said, we have to think about all those different types of users and all the different trips they undertake. And I think, and building that, as Adrian says, with a community enables that there's actually buy-in, that the community want this and see the benefit and therefore driving for it rather than being resistant against it if they don't feel it's going to meet their needs. Fantastic, thank you. And thank you for these great case studies that you presented. So we're at the end of our webinar session. Please feel free to follow up directly with Adrian and Neil via the contact details shown on the screen. Apologies for the PDF, it will be sent by email later on. And I would like to thank all attendees for joining today. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you Adrian and Neil for this presentation.
Thank you everyone. Thank you and goodbye.